The lie of the Rossi estate was a beautiful one on nights like tonight. With the harvest moon hanging fat and yellow over the Sonoma hills, and a string quartet playing softly on the terracotta terrace. Even I could almost believe it. From the outside, my life was a masterpiece of Californian success. Our Tuscan-style villa, built with the profits from a spectacular 2015 Cabernet Sauvignon, overlooked 300 acres of prime vineyard. The air smelled of money, night-blooming jasmine, and the deep, loamy promise of the land I had spent 30 years of my life cultivating. Tonight was our annual harvest party, the glittering apex of our social and professional calendar. It was a performance, and as always, I was the director, while my husband, Julian, was the star. I watched him now, moving through the crowd of distributors, critics, and wealthy wine club members. At 40, he was 22 years my junior, and he was breathtaking. Dressed in a custom-tailored linen suit, his golden blonde hair catching the light of the paper lanterns. He was the very picture of youthful, effortless success. He would laugh, a deep, musical sound, and refill the glass of a wine critic from New York. He would lean in and tell a charming, slightly embellished story about the challenges of the Zinfandel harvest to a potential investor from Texas. He was the face of Rossi Estate, handsome, charming, and utterly carefree. He was the romance. He was the dream I was selling. My role was different. At 62, I was the substance behind his style. I was the one who could discuss the nuances of soil pH with my vineyard manager, Ricardo. Our conversation a quiet, worried counterpoint to the party's cheerful buzz. I was the one who could debate the merits of French versus American oak barrels with a rival vintner from a neighboring estate. I was the one who, with a single taste of the new Pinot Noir, could identify the subtle, worrying note of smoke taint from the wildfires that had raged a county over, a flaw that could potentially ruin half our vintage. The yield was low this year, Isabel, Ricardo murmured to me in a quiet corner, his weathered face etched with the permanent anxiety of a man who fights with nature for a living. The drought, it's taking its toll. The reserve tanks are not as full as they should be. I know, Rico, I said, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. We'll manage. We always do. It was a small crack in the perfect facade, an undercurrent of hard reality that the guests, happily sipping their $100 a bottle Chardonnay, would never notice. They didn't see the crushing weight of the new loans I had taken out to upgrade our irrigation system. They didn't see the skyrocketing cost of insurance in a state that was perpetually on fire. They saw only the success, the beautiful, fragrant, and exquisitely crafted lie. Julian caught my eye from across the terrace and raised his glass to me, his smile a dazzling flash of white in the twilight. I smiled back, a practiced, serene expression I had perfected over the years. It was the smile of the proud, successful wife, the indulgent older woman who had caught herself a beautiful young husband. It was a smile that hid 1,000 calculations, 1,000 anxieties. It was the smile of a woman who knew the exact, astronomical cost of the beautiful lie she was living. Later that night, long after the last of the guests had departed, the lie came crashing down. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the industrial dishwasher in the kitchen and the soft, distant chirping of crickets. The party had been a success. Julian was on a high. Buzzing with the adrenaline of the crowd, the compliments, the endless refills of our best reserve. "That was incredible, wasn't it?" he said, loosening his tie as he walked into our large, modern bedroom. Chen from the restaurant group said he's doubling his order for the holidays. And that woman from the wine magazine, she was eating out of the palm of my hand. "I think we're looking at a cover story. Izzy, that's wonderful, darling," I said, my voice tired. I was sitting at my vanity, removing my jewelry. The exhaustion of the evening settling deep into my bones. "I'm going to go take a shower," he said, kissing the top of my head. "Wash all this success off me." He laughed and disappeared into the cavernous marble bathroom. I sat there for a moment, looking at my own reflection, the face of a 62-year-old woman. A successful woman, a tired woman, a woman who had, for the past 12 years, perhaps mistaken a beautiful acquisition for a partner. And then I heard the buzz. It was a soft, insistent vibration from the corner of our home office, which adjoined the bedroom. It wasn't my phone. It wasn't his usual phone. It was a different sound, a different device. My curiosity, a cold, quiet, and deeply logical thing, was piqued. I walked into the office. There, plugged into the wall behind his desk, was a sleek, new iPhone, a model I didn't recognize as his. It was buzzing again, the screen lit up with a notification. A text message from someone named Chloe Pilates. The message read, "Still awake, handsome, you were so amazing tonight. I couldn't keep my eyes off you. Wish I was showering with you right now." The world, which had been a warm, hazy blur of post-party fatigue, snapped into a cold, hyper-focused clarity. My hands did not shake. My breath did not catch. I simply reached down, my movements as calm and deliberate as if I were conducting a chemical analysis on a wine sample, and I picked up the phone. It was unlocked. I opened the text thread. It was a sewer. Weeks, months of messages, explicit photos, plans for secret meetups in San Francisco, and the thing that finally, truly broke me, their private, mocking commentary on our life, on me. "Chloe, is the old lady asleep yet?" "Julian, she's been asleep since 2010. "Don't worry, the bank is closed for the night." The bank, that's what I was, not his wife, not his partner. The bank, the endless, reliable, and apparently oblivious source of the funds that paid for his linen suits, his sports car, and his Pilates instructor girlfriend. I scrolled and scrolled, every message a fresh, brutal blow. The affair was not a recent indiscretion. It was a long-running, parallel life he had been living, funded by my work, my land, my wine. The humiliation was a physical thing, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of my stomach. I thought of his dazzling smile an hour before, the toast he had made to my brilliant, beautiful wife, the heart and soul of this winery. The words, which had felt merely performative at the time, were now revealed as a grotesque, cynical lie. The old me, the woman I had been before I walked into this office, would have screamed. She would have thrown the phone against the wall. She would have stormed into the bathroom and confronted him, a messy, tearful, and ultimately powerless explosion of righteous fury. But the woman I became in that moment, the woman who stood there, bathed in the cold, blue light of her own betrayal, did not scream. She got colder, calmer, more focused. I did not confront him. I retreated. I walked out of the office, closing the door softly behind me, and went downstairs to my own private study, the real heart of the Rossi estate. It was a room filled not with art and music, but with spreadsheets and financial statements, the place where the real work was done. The personal betrayal was a gaping, bleeding wound, but my mind, a mind trained to deal with crises immediately, sought refuge in the other, more familiar disaster that had been brewing for months, the financial state of the winery. I opened my laptop and pulled up the real numbers, the ones I never showed Julian, because he had never once in 12 years shown the slightest interest in them. The screen glowed with the ugly truth, a truth far more terrifying than a few sordid text messages. The loan payments on the new irrigation system were due. The disastrously low yields from the last 2 harvests meant our cash flow was in the red. The insurance premiums after the last fire season had tripled. We were leveraged to the hilt. A beautiful, sprawling estate that was just a few bad months away from complete insolvency. We were, to put it in the simplest terms, on the verge of bankruptcy. I sat there in the dead, silent heart of my failing empire, and I looked back and forth between the 2 screens. On my personal phone, which I had used to take pictures of, the texts on Julian's burner was the evidence of my personal ruin. On my laptop screen was the evidence of my professional ruin, and in that moment, in the depths of my despair, the 2 disasters, the 2 betrayals merged in my mind, and they formed a new, terrible and exquisitely beautiful solution. The bankruptcy was not a tragedy. The affair was not just a humiliation. They were tools. They were the raw materials for a revenge so perfect, so complete, that my cheating, parasitic husband would not only fail to see it coming. He would actively, greedily, and with a smug sense of his own brilliance, beg me for it. The plan descended upon me, fully formed, a masterpiece of cold, calculated fury. He thought I was the bank. Fine, I would give him exactly what he wanted. I would let him make a withdrawal. A withdrawal that would leave him not rich, but utterly, completely, and permanently bankrupt. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of my laptop. The face of the heartbroken, humiliated old lady was gone. In her place was the face of a woman who had just remembered who she was, a survivor, a builder. And a CEO, the performance of the grieving wife was about to begin. And it would be the greatest performance of my life. The morning after the harvest party, I woke before dawn. The house was silent, the air still and cool. Julian was asleep beside me, a faint, contented smile on his handsome face. No doubt dreaming of the accolades and cover stories he believed were his due. I looked at him. not with the fiery rage of a betrayed wife, but with the cold, dispassionate curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. I felt nothing but a profound, arctic emptiness. The love I had once felt for this man had been completely and utterly cauterized by the truth on that burner phone. He was not my partner. He was a parasite. And my first order of business was to methodically, quietly, and completely cut off his supply of blood. I slipped out of bed, dressed in the pre-dawn gloom, and went downstairs. I made a pot of strong, black coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the sun begin to illuminate the rolling hills of my vineyards, my land, my work. He had called me the bank. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. And it was a fatal miscalculation on his part. A bank is not a warm, forgiving creature. A bank keeps a ledger. A bank understands liability, and when a debt is called due. A bank is utterly without mercy. When he finally came downstairs, looking fresh and radiant after a full night's sleep, I had already been working for 3 hours. The performance began. I did not scream. I did not accuse. I presented him with the carefully constructed facade of a worried, overwhelmed wife. "Izzy, you're up early," he said, kissing me on the cheek. His lips felt like ice against my skin. "You look exhausted, still buzzing from the party." "No," I said, looking up from the kitchen table, which I had strewn with financial reports and vineyard yield projections. I made sure my expression was a mask of deep, weary anxiety. I couldn't sleep. "Julian, I was looking at the numbers, the harvest party. It was a beautiful performance. But the reality is we're in trouble." I showed him a carefully selected set of documents, the ones that showed the low grape yields from the drought, the rising costs of labor, the oppressive weight of our insurance premiums. It was all true. I just omitted the part about the catastrophic level of debt that made the situation not just difficult, but terminal. "I'm just so worried," I said, my voice a fragile, trembling thing. "This winery, it's my whole life. It's everything our parents worked for." This was a lie. My parents were retired teachers from Sacramento who had nothing to do with the winery I had built from scratch, but it was the kind of sentimental narrative Julie and understood. His reaction was exactly what I had predicted. He looked at the spreadsheets, his eyes glazing over with a familiar, bored incomprehension. He was an artist of the schmooze, the hard, ugly numbers of a balance sheet were a foreign language to him. "Oh, Izzy, don't worry your pretty head about this stuff," he said, patting my hand with a patronizing condescension that made my skin crawl. "You always figure it out. You're a genius. We're Rossi Estate. We're a success. Now, are you going to make me an omelette, or is the bank officially closed for breakfast?" He winked, completely oblivious to the double meaning of his words, and sauntered over to the espresso machine. I watched him, my expression one of worried fragility, but my heart was a cold, hard stone in my chest. He didn't see the numbers. He didn't care about the reality. He only saw the brand. He only cared about the lifestyle. And that was the fatal flaw I was going to exploit. My first call that morning was not to a divorce lawyer. It was to my personal attorney, a shrewd, silver-haired man from an old San Francisco firm named Marcus Thorne. I had him meet me not at his office, not at the winery, but at a discreet, anonymous coffee shop in a strip mall in Petaluma. "Isabel," he said, his expression grave as I sat down. "Your message sounded urgent." "It is," I said. I placed a small, slim manila folder on the table between us. Inside were the high-resolution photos I had taken of every single text message on Julian's burner. Phone. He opened the folder and read for a full 5 minutes, his expression hardening with every sordid detail. When he was done, he closed the folder and looked at me, his eyes full of a quiet, professional sympathy. "I am so sorry, Isabel. This is the unequivocal. We can file for divorce immediately. On grounds of adultery, we'll crucify him. He won't get a dime more than what the prenup stipulates." "No," I said calmly. "That is not the plan." He looked at me, confused. "What do you mean? The prenup is void." "Marcus," I said, "I made the foolish mistake of commingling my personal and business assets years ago to secure a line of credit. A good lawyer could argue that the entire winery is a marital asset. Julian's lawyer will argue that, and Julian, in his greed, will believe it. Then we fight him," Marcus said. "We argue that his contributions to the business were negligible. We can—" "No," I interrupted again. "We are not going to fight him for the winery. We are going to give it to him, or at least half of it." I leaned forward, my voice dropping. "What I am about to tell you is protected by attorney-client privilege. I am not just divorcing my husband, Marcus. I am orchestrating a controlled demolition of my own business, and I need you to make sure I do it in a way that is perfectly, unimpeachably legal." For the next hour, I walked him through my plan. I showed him the real financial statements for the winery, the ones that showed the crushing, multi-million-dollar debt hidden behind the veneer of success. I explained my strategy to play the part of the heartbroken, emotionally devastated wife, to feign a desperate, clinging attachment to the winery, and in doing so, to encourage Julian's greed and ensure that he fought for and won his 50% share, a 50% share of an entity that was, for all intents and purposes, a financial black hole. Marcus listened, his sharp, legal mind processing every detail. When I was finished, he was silent for a long time, just looking at me with a new, profound, and slightly terrified respect. "My God, Isabel," he whispered, "it's brutal, it's diabolical, and it's the most brilliant piece of legal and financial strategy I have ever seen. It's a work of art." He allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Where do we begin?" My next meeting was with my accountant, a quiet, meticulous woman named Sarah who had managed my books for 20 years. We met in her anonymous office in a corporate park in Santa Rosa. There we began the real work, the strategic collapse. "The key," I explained, pointing to a line on the balance sheet, "is to increase the LLC's debt load while simultaneously extracting my personal, premarital assets." We need to do it in a way that is aggressive but defensible, and so we began. The first step was a new, massive loan. I approached a new commercial bank, one we had never worked with before. And I pitched them, just as Victoria had in the previous story, on an expansion. I used the winery's still inflated public reputation and slightly outdated property appraisals to secure a $2 million line of credit. I told Julian it was for a new, state-of-the-art bottling facility that would double our output. He was ecstatic, seeing only the confirmation of his own success. He immediately started planning a lavish trip to Europe to celebrate the moment the loan was approved. The money was wired to the Rossi Estate LLC's account. The very next day, I, as the sole director and officer of the corporation, convened an emergency board meeting, of which I was the only member. I approved a $2 million management bonus for myself, citing my 30 years of extraordinary service and intellectual property in building the Rossi Estate brand. The money was then legally transferred from the LLC's account into my own personal protected pre-marital trust account. It was a breathtakingly audacious move, one that made my accountant blanch and my lawyer break out in a cold sweat. But it was, as Marcus confirmed after a week of frantic research, legally defensible. I hadn't stolen the money. The company had simply paid its primary creditor what she was owed. The company, in turn, was now $1 million deeper in debt, while I was financially gutting the business from the inside. I simultaneously ramped up the external performance of its success. I hired a trendy San Francisco design firm to create a new, more luxurious label for our wines, a completely unnecessary expense that Julian adored. I bought a new Range Rover as a company car and insisted Julian drive it, a visible symbol of our continued prosperity. I hosted a series of small, incredibly expensive dinners for influential wine critics, ensuring that the final articles written about Rossi Estate before its demise would be glowing. Every move was a piece of cheese in the trap, a carefully placed breadcrumb leading my greedy, unsuspecting husband down the path to his own financial ruin. By the end of the month, the work was done. My personal assets were secure, protected by a firewall of trusts and legal entities, and Rossi Estate LLC, my life's work, the beautiful, celebrated winery I had poured my soul into, was a hollowed-out shell. It was a magnificent, beautiful, and completely bankrupt company, a financial time bomb waiting for a new owner to be placed on the deed. The final step was a visit to my lawyer's office. Marcus had the completed Chapter 11 bankruptcy petition on his desk. It was a document thicker than a phone book, a masterpiece of legal and financial maneuvering. It was ready. All it needed was a date and a signature. He looked at me, his expression serious. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Isabel?" he asked one last time. "You're sacrificing your own creation, 30 years of your life." I looked out his window at the distant, fog-shrouded silhouette of the Golden Gate Bridge. I thought of my beautiful vineyards, of the legacy I was about to destroy. Then I thought of the text message on that burner phone. The bank is closed for the night. A good businesswoman knows when an asset has become a liability. Marcus, I said, my voice as cold and clear as a winter morning. The winery is a liability. It's time to liquidate. I stood up and smoothed the front of my dress. The meticulous, brutal, and deeply satisfying work of the strategic collapse was complete. Now, it was time for the second act of my performance to begin, the part where I played the victim. The day I filed for divorce was a perfect Sonoma County morning, the sky a crisp, cloudless blue. I stood on my terrace, a cup of coffee in hand, and looked out over the vineyards that I was about to sacrifice. There was a strange, hollow ache in my chest, the grief of a general about to scorch her own earth to win a war. This was my life's work, this land, this business. And I was going to burn it to the ground to punish the man who had taken it all for granted. In my lawyer's office an hour later, the performance began. I was no longer the cold, calculating CEO. I was the heartbroken, emotionally fragile, 62-year-old woman whose younger husband had betrayed her, Marcus. I just don't know if I can go through with this, I said. My voice a carefully constructed imitation of trembling uncertainty. I twisted a handkerchief in my hands, a prop I had brought specifically for this purpose. 12 years, it's a long time. Maybe we can still fix it. Maybe it was just a mistake. Marcus, my shrewd, silver-haired lawyer and now my co-conspirator, played his part beautifully. He adopted the tone of a firm but sympathetic advisor. Isabel, he said gently, we've been over this. The evidence is clear. His infidelity is not a mistake. It is a pattern. You deserve better. We proceed as planned. His words were for the benefit of the two junior associates in the room, the ones who would be handling the paperwork, the ones who would, in the coming weeks, whisper to their colleagues about the sad, tragic case of the brilliant Isabel Rossi, who seemed to be emotionally crumbling under the pressure of her divorce. The narrative had to be perfect, both inside my legal team and out. I allowed him to convince me. I signed the divorce petition with a trembling hand and a single, well-timed tear that I let splash onto the signature line. The performance had begun. Julian was served the papers 2 days later. I made sure it happened in the most public, most humiliating way possible. He was in the middle of hosting a private tasting for a group of wealthy wine bloggers in our main tasting room, regaling them with a story about his first harvest. A discreet, professionally dressed process server walked in, waited for a pause in his story, and said, in a voice loud enough for the entire room to hear, "Mr. Julian Croft, you've been served." The ensuing scene, as reported to me later by a gleeful tasting room manager, was a joy to imagine. The shocked silence, the bloggers suddenly fascinated by their phones, trying to capture the drama, Julian's handsome face turning a deep, ugly shade of red as he was handed the papers, the swift, complete implosion of his carefully crafted, bon vivant persona. His rage, when it came, was immediate and predictable. He hired the flashiest, most aggressive divorce attorney in Santa Rosa. A man whose face was plastered on billboards up and down the 101. Within a week, Marcus received their official response. It was not a settlement offer, it was a declaration of war. As I had predicted, his lawyer had advised him that our prenuptial agreement was vulnerable. Julian was demanding his rightful share of the marital assets and the primary asset he wanted, the one he claimed he had built with his own sweat equity and brand management, was 50% of Rossi Estate LLC. The first mediation session was held in a sterile, soulless conference room in a downtown office building. It was the perfect stage for my performance. I dressed the part, a simple, elegant but somber black dress, no makeup, my hair pulled back in a severe bun. I looked like a grieving widow. Julian, on the other hand, arrived looking like he was on his way to a photo shoot, dressed in a peacock blue suit, his face a mask of righteous indignation. He and his lawyer came out swinging. They painted a picture of Julian as the creative genius behind the Rossi Estate's success. They talked about the press he had generated, the high-profile events he had hosted, the brand identity he had cultivated. His lawyer used phrases like emotional labor and synergistic partnership. It was a masterclass in corporate speak bullshit, designed to obscure the simple fact that he had been a glorified party host. I, in turn, played my part. I flinched at their accusations. I seemed to shrink in my chair when Marcus, my lawyer, tried to argue. I would place a trembling hand on his arm, as if to say, "Don't fight them, it's no use, Mrs. Rossi," Julian's lawyer said, his tone dripping with condescension. "My client is not a monster, he is simply asking for what is fair. He dedicated 12 years of his life to building this brand with you. He is entitled to half of it. It's not a brand," I whispered, my voice thick with fake emotion. "It's my family's legacy. It's my home. It is a limited liability company with an estimated market valuation of $8 million. The lawyer retorted coldly. This was the cue for our first offer. Marcus, with a weary sigh, presented it. "My client," he said, "in the interest of avoiding a protracted and painful battle, is prepared to offer Mr. Croft the marital home, free and clear. Both vehicles and a what-time tax-free cash settlement of $1 million. It was a staggeringly generous offer, enough for Julian to live a very comfortable life. I watched his face. For a moment, a flicker of pure, animal greed lit up his eyes. He was tempted, but then he looked at me, at my pathetic, crumbling facade. He saw weakness, and he smelled blood in the water. Rejected, his lawyer said instantly. "My client is not interested in cash. He is interested in his equity. He wants his half of the winery, the business he built." Julian just nodded, a smug, self-satisfied look on his face. He truly believed it. He had repeated the lie to himself so many times that it had become his truth. The mediation ended in a stalemate, as I knew it would. In the hallway, Marcus turned to me, his real concern momentarily breaking through his own performance. "Isabel, that was a fortune. You offered him a fortune. Why? Because, Marcus, I whispered, dabbing at my dry eyes with the handkerchief. I need him to be absolutely certain that the winery is the most valuable thing I own. I need him to be desperate for it. The next few months were a slow, agonizing chess game. We had more mediation sessions. Each time Marcus, on my instruction, would increase the cash offer, and each time I would put on a more desperate, more emotionally fragile performance. I would talk about my late father, the high school history teacher, and the promise I had made to him to keep the non-existent family legacy alive. I would weep as I described my connection to the land, to the vines. My performance was so convincing that even Julian began to look a little uncomfortable. Like a schoolyard bully who is surprised when his victim actually starts to cry, but his greed always won out. My desperation to keep the winery only confirmed his belief in its immense value. He was convinced I was hiding profits, that the business was a golden goose he was being cheated out of. He refused every offer. He wanted the winery. He wanted his 50%. The final mediation session was our last chance to avoid a court battle. Marcus, with a heavy, theatrical sigh, made our final offer to $1 million in cash, alimony for life, and I would personally pay for a 3-month trip to Europe for him and his Pilates instructor girlfriend. Julian's lawyer actually looked tempted. He knew this was a good deal. He knew that going to court was a risk. I saw him lean over and whisper to Julian, but Julian just shook his head, a stubborn, greedy look on his face. He was a dog with a bone, and he would not let go. He looked at me, at my tear-streaked face, and he saw his final victory, the ultimate punishment for my leaving him. He would take my one true love, the winery, away from me. No, Julian said, his voice firm, I want my half of the business. That is my final offer. I let out a shuddering sob. I buried my face in my hands. Marcus put a comforting arm around my shoulder. My client is distraught. He said to the mediator, but she is also exhausted. She cannot fight anymore. I looked up, my eyes red, my expression one of complete and utter defeat. I looked at Julian. Fine, I whispered, the word a fragile, broken thing. You win, Julian, you win. If I give you half of the winery, will you just go? Will you just leave me in peace? The look of triumph on his face was a sickening, beautiful thing to behold. It was the look of a fool who believes he is just checkmated a grandmaster, completely unaware that he has been marching his king into a trap the entire game. Yes, Isabel, he said, his voice now soft, magnanimous in his victory. Of course, I just want what's fair. The lawyers began to draw up the final agreement. Julian would be made a 50% partner in Rossi Estate LLC. I watched them draft the clauses. My heart a cold, steady beat in my chest. We signed the papers. Julian's signature was a bold, triumphant slash of ink. My own signature was a shaky, tear-blotted scrawl. I pushed the signed document across the table, the final act of my greatest performance. I had successfully, masterfully, and with the full force of my broken heart, convinced my enemy that the anchor I was handing him was, in fact, a life raft The stage was set, the trap was baited. All that was left was for the judge's gavel to fall and for the serving of the final, devastating course. The morning of our final court date, I woke to a world that felt unnervingly still, the Sonoma fog pressing a heavy, grey blanket against the windows of my house. This was the day of the judgment. The day I would officially, legally, and in the eyes of the state of California lose half of my life's work. I dressed for the occasion not as a warrior, but as a mourner. I chose a simple, conservative, and brutally expensive charcoal grey suit, the kind of armor a CEO wears to an unpleasant shareholder meeting. My hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon. My face was pale, my expression somber. I was playing the part of a woman attending a funeral. My own, the Sonoma County Courthouse, was an imposing, mission-style building, its halls smelling of old wood, for polish and the quiet, desperate anxieties of 100 different legal battles. I arrived with my lawyer, Marcus, exactly 15 minutes early. We sat on a hard wooden bench in the hallway, the silence between us thick with a shared, unspoken tension. This was the final act of our long, elaborate, and deeply cynical play. Julian arrived 5 minutes before the hearing, and he did not come alone. He strode down the hallway as if it were a red carpet, his peacock blue suit perfectly tailored, his face tan and confident, and on his arm, clinging to him like a designer handbag, was Chloe, the Pilates instructor. She was young, blonde, and wearing a white dress that was just a little too tight, a brazen, tasteless display of victory. Julian was not just here to win, he was here to gloat. He was bringing his new life to witness the official death of his old one. He saw me, and a slow, triumphant smirk spread across his face. He nodded at me, a gesture of pure, condescending pity, as if to say, "Look what you've lost. Look what I've won." I met his gaze, allowed my own expression to crumble just a little, to show the pain and heartbreak he so desperately wanted to see, and then I looked away. Back at the scuffed floor tiles, playing the part of the defeated woman to perfection, he and Chloe sat on the opposite bench, her laughter echoing unnaturally in the quiet, somber hallway. The courtroom itself was a theater of mahogany and faded glory. We took our places at our respective tables. I sat with my back ramrod straight, my eyes fixed on the judge's empty chair, a perfect statue of dignified grief. Julian, on the other hand, was relaxed, almost giddy. He kept leaning over to whisper in his lawyer's ear, a smug, conspiratorial look on his face. He believed he was just minutes away from the biggest payday of his life. The judge, a formidable woman named Judge Elaine Saunders with a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency, entered and the proceedings began. It was, as I had planned, largely a formality. The real battle had been fought and ostensibly lost in the mediation. Julian's lawyer, a man with slicked-back hair and a voice as smooth as aged whiskey, stood to make his final statement. He was magnificent in his self-righteous grandstanding. He spoke of Julian's invaluable, synergistic contributions to the Rossi estate brand. He painted a picture of my husband as a marketing genius, a visionary who had transformed a simple winery into a global lifestyle brand. He spoke of fairness, of equity, of the 12 years of his client's life poured into the soil of that land. It was a beautiful, compelling, and almost entirely fictional speech. Then it was Marcus's turn, and he was, if possible, even more brilliant. He did not argue facts or figures. He argued with emotion. He played the part of the devoted family lawyer, forced to watch his client's heart be torn out. His voice was heavy with a sorrowful resignation. He spoke of my deep, almost spiritual connection to the land. He described the winery not as an LLC, but as the culmination of a multi-generational family dream. A complete fabrication that he knew would play on the court's sympathies. "Your Honor," he pleaded, his voice thick with a perfectly feigned despair, "my client is not a corporation. She is a woman who has poured her soul into that vineyard. We have made generous, almost reckless, financial offers to Mr. Croft to avoid this very outcome. But he remains insistent on taking not just a share of the assets, but a share of her very identity." He looked over at me, his eyes full of a deep, paternal concern that was so convincing, it almost made me believe it. "We only ask that the court recognize the profound human cost of this transaction." He sat down. The performance was complete. We had successfully painted a picture of a greedy, opportunistic young husband tearing a beloved, priceless legacy from the hands of his heartbroken, emotionally fragile older wife. Judge Saunders looked from the signed mediation agreement to me, her expression softening with a flicker of sympathy. "Ms. Rossi," she said, her voice not unkind, "I have reviewed the agreement you signed. While I am sympathetic to the emotional toll that is clearly taking on you, the law is the law. The Rossi estate was legally established as a marital asset, and you and your husband have come to a legally binding agreement to divide that asset equally." She picked up her gavel. I held my breath. "Therefore," she declared, her voice echoing in the silent courtroom, "this court hereby ratifies the mediation agreement in full. Ownership of Rossi Estate LLC shall be divided equally, with 50% of all shares, assets, and liabilities awarded to the petitioner, Ms. Isabel Rossi, and 50% awarded to the respondent, Mr. Julian Croft." The gavel came down with a sharp, definitive crack. Thump. It was done. Julian let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh of victory, a triumphant, wolfish grin flashed across his face before he schooled it into a more somber expression for the benefit of the judge. He clapped his lawyer on the back, a gesture of pure, unadulterated triumph, and I, on cue, performed my final, devastating act of grief. My shoulders slumped. I brought my handkerchief to my eyes and let out a single, shuddering sob. Marcus placed a consoling hand on my back, whispering words of comfort that I couldn't hear over the roaring, triumphant sound of my own silent laughter. The trap had been sprung. The cheese had been taken. We all stood as the judge exited. I remained seated for a long moment, pretending to compose myself. Julian and his lawyer, buzzing with victory, made their way out into the hallway. Finally, Marcus helped me to my feet, and we walked slowly, defeatedly, out of the courtroom. Julian was waiting for us in the hall, his pretty, blonde girlfriend back on his arm. He couldn't resist the final, gloating twist of the knife. He stepped in front of me, his face a mask of condescending sympathy. "Isabel," he said, his voice dripping with a false sincerity that was more insulting than any shout. "I know this is hard, but it's for the best. Don't worry." He gave me that smug, devastating smirk. "I'll take very good care of my winery." I looked at him. I looked at the beautiful, stupid, greedy man for whom I had just sacrificed my life's work. I was about to reply, but I didn't have to dot at that exact, perfect, and exquisitely timed moment. A man in a crisp, professional suit who had been waiting patiently on a nearby bench stood up. "Julian Croft?" he asked, his voice flat, professional, and utterly devoid of emotion. Julian, still glowing with his victory, turned, annoyed at the interruption. "Yes," he said, his tone arrogant. The man stepped forward and held out a thick, heavy, and deeply intimidating packet of legal documents. "You've been served," he said. Julian stared at the packet, a flicker of confusion crossing his handsome face. He took it from the process server, who simply nodded and walked away, his job done. "What is this?" Julian's lawyer asked, stepping forward. Julian, with a dismissive laugh, tore open the envelope. "Probably just some final paperwork from the court," he said, still looking at me. "Don't worry, Izzy, I'm sure my lawyer can handle." His voice trailed off. His eyes had fallen on the first page of the document in his hands. I watched him read the words. I watched the blood drain from his tanned, handsome face. I watched his smug, triumphant expression dissolve, replaced by a slack-jawed, ashen-faced mask of pure, uncomprehending horror. His lawyer snatched the document from his hand. I saw his own eyes widen as he read the title at the top of the page: United States Bankruptcy Court, Northern District of California, notice of Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing and commencement of case N. O to 511380 N. Ray, Rossi Estate, LLC, debtor Julian. Frantically flipped through the pages, his hands now trembling. He saw the list of creditors, he saw the asset valuations, and he saw the final, staggering, multi-million-dollar number at the bottom of the statement of liabilities. He looked up, his eyes wild, uncomprehending. He looked at his lawyer, at the terrifying document, and then, finally, at me. The heartbroken, weeping woman he had seen in the courtroom was gone. In her place stood a woman he had never seen before, a woman whose expression was calm, cold, and utterly, devastatingly victorious. "You're bankrupt," he whispered, the words a puff of air, his voice full of a child's disbelief. "No, Julian," I said, my voice quiet, clear, and perfectly steady. "We are bankrupt." And in that moment, he finally, truly understood. The lifeboat he had fought so hard for, the one he had stolen from me, was not a lifeboat at all. It was a block of solid lead. And he was now, by the full force and authority of the state of California, chained to it. The trap had sprung, and it was perfect. The moment Julian's brain finally processed the words on the bankruptcy filing, the moment his greed and triumph curdled into pure, uncomprehending terror, was the true and final dividend of my third-year investment in the Rossi estate. His handsome, smug face, the one that had charmed critics and seduced Pilates instructors, collapsed. The color drained from his skin, leaving a sick, grey pallor. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked from the damning document in his trembling hands to me, his eyes wide with the frantic, pleading panic of a drowning man who has just realized the thing he is clinging to is not a life raft, but a millstone. His lawyer, the slick-haired shark who had been so aggressive in mediation, snatched the papers from him. I watched his own professional composure dissolve as he read. His face went from confusion to disbelief to a kind of horrified, professional respect for the sheer, brutal elegance of the trap he and his client had so eagerly walked into. This is impossible, Julian finally stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. He turned on me, his terror finally finding an outlet in a surge of impotent rage. You did this. This is a trick. It's illegal. You can't do this. He took a step towards me, his hands clenched into fists. Marcus, my lawyer, immediately stepped between us. I would advise your client to control himself. Counsel, he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl directed at Julian's now useless attorney. This is a courthouse. Chloe, the girlfriend, who had been watching this all unfold with a look of bored confusion, finally seemed to understand the key words: bankrupt, debt, millions. The triumphant, proprietary look on her face, the look of a woman who had just secured her financial future, vanished. It was replaced by the cold, hard calculation of a person realizing their investment has just been rendered worthless. She took a small, almost imperceptible step away from Julian, then another. Without a word, without a backward glance, she turned and walked quickly down the echoing marble hallway, her high heels clicking a brisk, final retreat. The first rat was deserting the sinking ship. You bitch, Julian screamed at my back as Marcus gently guided me away. You ruined me. I did not turn around. I did not dignify his tantrum with a response. I just kept walking, my step steady, my posture erect, leaving him there in the hallway of the Sonoma County Courthouse to scream at the ghost of the fortune he thought he had won. The performance was over, my part was done, and the silence of my victory was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The weeks that followed were a grim, unglamorous, and deeply satisfying education for Mr. Julian Croft. The Chapter 11 bankruptcy of a business like Rossi Estate was not a quiet, private affair. It was a public vivisection, and as a 50% owner, he was legally required to be on the operating table. He had to attend endless, soul-crushing meetings with creditors, with the trustees, with the battalion of lawyers and accountants, hired to pick over the bones of our dead empire. I was there too, of course, playing the part of the cooperative, heartbroken founder, helping to make the liquidation as smooth as possible. I watched him from across sterile conference room tables. The confident, golden blonde charmer was gone, replaced by a haggard, shell-shocked man who was drowning in a world of balance sheets and liability statements he could not comprehend. He was hounded by suppliers he had never met, demanding payment for grapes and bottles he had never ordered. He was forced to sit through depositions where he had to repeatedly, humiliatingly, admit that he had no knowledge of the winery's finances, its operations, or its massive, crippling debt. He, who had claimed in court to be the architect of the brand's success, was now being exposed to a room full of stony-faced bankers as a complete and utter fraud, a man who had been nothing more than a well-dressed mascot. The beautiful lie of his life was dismantled, piece by painful piece. The Range Rover, a company asset, was repossessed. The winery's bank accounts, which he was now a signatory on, were frozen and then drained by the bankruptcy court. He had to sell the house the court had awarded him, just to pay his own mounting legal fees. My private investigator, whom I had kept on retainer for one final task, gave me a brief, final report. Julian Croft was living in a small, rented apartment above a garage in a less fashionable part of town. His legal bills were astronomical, and his Pilates instructor girlfriend had not returned a single one of his 53 phone calls. He was ruined, he was alone, and he had done it all to himself. The process was not without its own pain for me, watching the business I had built from a single, hopeful acre of land be dismantled was like attending my own long, drawn-out funeral. The land, my beautiful, sun-drenched vineyards, was sold to a corporate competitor from Napa. The state-of-the-art equipment was auctioned off. The name, Rossi Estate, my father's name, was dissolved, its brand equity now officially worth zero. But with every piece of the old life that was stripped away, I felt lighter. I was losing my legacy, but I was also shedding a decade of debt, of struggle, and of the crushing weight of a parasitic marriage. It was a controlled burn. I was sacrificing the overgrown, diseased forest of my past to allow for the possibility of new growth. A year later, the fire was out. The bankruptcy was finalized. Rossi Estate was gone, and I was free. I did not flee Sonoma. This valley was in my blood. But I left the grand villa on the hill with the personal, premarital assets I had so carefully protected. I bought a smaller, more intimate property on the other side of the county, a beautiful, rustic, 10-acre plot on the back slope of a mountain, with an old, lovingly restored farmhouse. It was not a palace. It was a home. I am sitting on the porch of that home now. It is a warm, late autumn afternoon. The air smells of dry grass and oak trees. In front of me is not a vast, commercial vineyard, but a small 3-acre plot of land where I have begun a new, deeply personal project. I am cultivating a single, difficult, and obscure Italian grape varietal, Fiorno, a grape that the big corporate wineries say is too much trouble to grow in this climate. It is not a business. It is a passion project, an experiment. It is just for me. My revenge on Julian was a masterpiece of financial destruction. It was a cold, brilliant, and perfectly executed trap that had used his own greed as its primary mechanism. But as I sit here, in the quiet, peaceful solitude of my new life, I know that my real victory was not his ruin, it was my own survival. He had tried to take my life's work, and in doing so, had forced me to see that it had become a beautiful, gilded cage. The winery had become a thing to be protected, to be insured, to be worried over. It had become a liability. By sacrificing it, I had not just destroyed him, I had liberated myself. I look at the glass of wine in my hand. It is not one of my own. It is from a small, local vineyard run by a young, ambitious couple down the road, to whom I have been offering my advice and mentorship. I take a sip. It is full of promise. It tastes of the sun, of the soil, and of a future that is still waiting to be written. I did not just survive my husband's betrayal, I had leveraged it. I had used it as a fire to burn away the non-essential, to strip my life down to its core components, the land, the work, the quiet satisfaction of creating something beautiful. He thought he was taking my fortune. He had no idea that, in the end, he was the one who was setting me free. 3 years, it takes 3 years, at a minimum, for a newly planted grapevine to produce a harvest worthy of making wine. 3 years of patience, of toil, of faith in the soil and the sun, for me. Those 3 years were a period of quiet, deliberate, and deeply healing reconstruction. The violent, chaotic demolition of my old life, the divorce, the bankruptcy, the public immolation of the Rossi estate brand had faded into a distant, almost cinematic memory. The frantic, high-stakes world of corporate winemaking was gone. In its place was something quieter, smaller, and infinitely more profound, the slow, patient work of building something new. Just for myself, my new home, a rustic but elegant farmhouse, on a 10-acre plot in the quiet hills of the Russian River Valley, had become my sanctuary. The land was not the prime, show-stopping real estate of my former life. It was a difficult, challenging piece of earth with rocky soil and a unique microclimate. The big corporate wineries had all dismissed it as unplantable, which, of course, was exactly why I had bought it. Here, I had planted my rebellion. Not a vast, profitable ocean of Cabernet Sauvignon, but 3 acres of Fiorno, a difficult, obscure, and wonderfully aromatic white grape from southern Italy. It was a grape that required constant attention, that was susceptible to frost, that demanded a level of care and intimacy that was impossible in a large-scale operation. It was a vintner's grape, a passion project. It was, everyone in the Sonoma wine community had politely told me, a fool's errand. And today, on a crisp, perfect morning in late September, the fool was harvesting her first crop. The scene was a world away from the massive, impersonal harvests at the old Rossi estate. There were no rumbling mechanical harvesters, no teams of anonymous migrant workers. There was just me, my old friend and lawyer Marcus Thorne, my loyal accountant Sarah, and the young winemaking couple from down the road, Ben and Maria, whom I had been mentoring. We moved down the rows of vines, our hands carefully snipping the small, golden green clusters of grapes, the air filled with the sweet, honeyed scent of the ripe fruit and the sound of our own quiet conversation and easy laughter. I stood. "Can't believe you did this, Isabel," Marcus said, carefully placing a cluster of grapes into a lug box. He had aged in the past few years, his hair now completely white, but his eyes were sharper than ever. You could be on a beach in Tahiti instead. "You're farming a grape nobody has ever heard of on a hill nobody wanted. Tahiti is boring." "Marcus," I said with a smile, the sun warm on my face, "there are no complex problems to solve in Tahiti. And how is this vintage looking from a problem solver's perspective?" he asked. I plucked a single grape from a vine, held it up to the light, then popped it in my mouth. The skin was thin, the flesh bursting with a complex flavor notes of citrus, hazelnut, and something else, a flinty minerality that came from this difficult, rocky soil. It was perfect. "The yield is low," I said, echoing the worries of my past life, "but the quality is extraordinary." This was the difference. At the old estate, a low yield was a financial disaster. A red line on a balance sheet that would mean angry investors and sleepless nights. Here, it was a sign of concentrated flavor, of quality over quantity. It was not a liability. It was a choice. We worked all day, and as the sun began to dip towards the coastal range, casting a long golden light over my small, improbable vineyard, we brought in the last of the harvest. It was a tiny amount, barely enough to produce a few hundred cases, but it was mine. Every grape was a testament to a new kind of success, a success measured not in market share, but in personal satisfaction. The months that followed were a return to my roots. I was no longer a CEO, a director of a large operation. I was a winemaker. I was in the cellar every day, my hands stained purple, my senses alive with the alchemical process of fermentation. I racked the wine, I tasted it from the barrel, I watched it evolve and mature. I was not delegating, I was creating. The ghost of Julian, the man who had been the catalyst for this new life, had long since faded. The last I had heard, through the ever-turning rumor mill of the valley, was that he had moved to Florida to try and sell luxury real estate, a profession for which his slick, superficial charm was probably better suited. He was a footnote in my story, a character from a previous, less interesting book. My focus was on the future, on the beautiful, complex, and slightly wild wine that was aging in my small cellar. I decided to call it Phoenix, the Italian word for phoenix, a bird born from the ashes of its own funeral pyre. When the time finally came to bottle it, almost a year and a half after that first hopeful harvest, I knew I had to mark the occasion. Not with a lavish party or a big press event, but with something small, something meaningful. I decided to host a simple, private tasting. The guest list was short: Marcus and Sarah, my loyal co-conspirators, Ben and Maria, the next generation of Sonoma winemakers, and my old vineyard manager from the Rossi estate, Ricardo. a man whose family had worked the soil of this valley for 100 years, and whom I had hired as a consultant for my new foolish venture. The tasting was on my porch, on a warm, clear evening. We sat around a simple wooden table as the sun set, and then, just as I was about to open the first bottle, a car I didn't recognize pulled up my long, gravel driveway. An older, distinguished-looking man got out. It was Arthur Vance, the most respected, most feared, and most influential wine critic on the West Coast, a man whose reviews could make or break a winery. He had been to the Rossi estate many times, and his praise had been a key pillar of my former success. I had not invited him. He walked up to the porch, a slightly apologetic look on his face. "Isabel," he said, his voice a familiar, gravelly baritone. "Forgive the intrusion. I heard a rumor. A rumor so unbelievable I had to see for myself. They said you were growing Fiano on the backside of this mountain. I told them they were insane. They were probably right," I said with a smile. "But please, Arthur, join us. You're just in time." The mood on the porch shifted. It was no longer just a gathering of friends. It was a premiere, a judgment. I felt a flicker of the old, familiar anxiety, the pressure to perform, to impress, but it vanished as quickly as it came. I was not seeking his approval. I was simply sharing my work. I opened the bottle of Venice, the cork coming out with a soft, satisfying sigh. I poured a small amount into each glass. The wine was a beautiful, pale gold in the fading light. We all held our glasses, the silence of the evening broken only by the sound of crickets. I watched Arthur's face as he went through his familiar ritual. He swirled the wine. He held it to the light. He buried his nose in the glass. His expression was unreadable, a mask of pure, professional concentration. He finally took a small, contemplative sip. He held the wine in his mouth for a long time, his eyes closed. The silence on the porch stretched into an eternity. Then he swallowed. He opened his eyes, and he looked at me. "My God, Isabel," he whispered, his voice full of a quiet, profound awe. He took another sip, his expression now one of dawning wonder. "The wine you made at Rossi Estate," he said slowly, choosing his words with care, "was impressive. It was technically flawless, powerful, and ambitious. It was a wine built to win awards. It was the wine of ACO." He swirled the Fiano in his glass, watching the way it clung to the sides. "But this," he said, his voice now filled with a genuine, unfeigned passion, "this is something else entirely. It's complex, it's defiant, it's alive. It tastes of the rock, of the sun, of a struggle. This is not the wine of a CEO, Isabel." He looked up at me, a look of deep, profound respect in his eyes. "This is the wine of an artist. This is the wine you were always meant to make." And in that moment, the last, lingering ghost of the Rossi estate, of the woman I used to be, finally, completely and peacefully dissolved. My greatest success was not the multi-million-dollar empire I had built and then so spectacularly destroyed. It was this small, perfect, and deeply authentic creation I had nurtured from its ashes. Later that night, After everyone had gone home, I sat alone on my porch, a final glass of Venice in my hand. The stars were brilliant in the clear, dark sky. My revenge on Julian had been a masterpiece of destruction, a cold and satisfying checkmate. But this quiet, beautiful, and deeply personal success, this was not revenge, this was redemption. I had not just survived my past, I had turned it into something beautiful, and it tasted like victory.